Hi, everyone. Welcome to Drisha Sphyra Programming and to the first week of our new series with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, the Torah, What is to Become of It? Rabbanit Sarna is the Associate Director of Education and the Director of High School Programs at Drisha. She previously served as the Director of Religious Engagement at Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation in Chicago, a leading urban Orthodox congregation. She was ordained at Yeshivat Mahara in 2018, holds a BA from Yale University in Philosophy and Psychology, and also trained at the SKA Beit Midrash for Women at Migdal Oz, Drisha, and the Center for Modern Torah Leadership. We encourage you to ask questions either by unmuting yourself or by putting questions in the chat. If you are comfortable doing so, we'd love for you to turn on your camera and actively participate throughout the class. And now over to you, Rabbanit Sarna.
Thanks so much, Chaya. Welcome to the Drisha team. We're so excited to have you. Just it feels strange to jump into something without noting that we're in just sort of these last moments, at least in the East Coast, these last moments of Yom HaShoah. And what we're going to be talking about tonight doesn't have a lot to do with that. But it just feels like we can't begin without commemorating the incredible loss of the Jewish people experienced in the previous century, and it's just on all of our minds. Okay, so with that, this course is going to be tracing a phrase in the Talmud that appears just a couple of times, but every time is amazing in its own right. And it's all these different and quite important people saying, Torah, ma taha aleha. So in this situation, whatever situation it is, and we'll look at three different ones, and if I do the following thing, or if the following thing is allowed to stand, or if one were to do the following thing, what would happen to the Torah? Which is just kind of like an incredible way of thinking about Torah in general, incredible question to ask, because what the question belies is maybe the Torah needs protection. Maybe it's our job to ask that question. If I do this, what will happen to the Torah? If we do this, what will happen to the Torah? And it suggests that the Torah needs something from us. It needs our protection in a certain way. And then the question is, when we look at these stories, we're going to say, well, if the Torah needs protection, what does that look like? What kind of protection are we supposed to be offering? And the idea of talking about this now is that we're leading up to the holiday of Shavuot during Sphyra, and there's kind of two pieces of Sphyra that feel actually quite relevant to this. One is holiday of Shavuot, and actually after the Talmud. It's always, I feel like people don't know this, but the Talmud doesn't know that Shavuot is like the day of Matan Torah, because within the Talmud, there's a big debate listing all these different times that until the calendar is set, the 50th day after Pesach is not necessarily Vav Sivan. And in the Talmud, there's a big debate about when exactly Matan Torah happened. So not only is Shavuot not necessarily Vav Sivan, the 6th day of Sivan, but in the Talmud, we don't even know what day Matan Torah actually happened on. So we have those two confounding elements. And yet, over time, Shavuot has most certainly become associated, and in our liturgy, we refer to it as Zman Matan Toratinu, the day when we remember the Torah being given. I have some published writing about this. If anyone is interested in learning more, I can send it your way. But I do think that it's always shocking for people to hear how late that association is. And yet that's very true to our experience of Shavuos, is that it's a holiday all about Torah. And about kind of this reacceptance of the Torah as well. That each year we kind of bring the Torah does say that on Shavuot we bring a mincha chadasha, a new grain offering, and I love suggesting that and I'm far from the first one to do so, but the medieval commentators already suggested that the part of what we do on Shavuot is we bring a mincha, like an offering, a gift to God of chidush, That's the mincha chadasha, is an offering of chidush, an offering of new Torah, of Torah renewed for us, a Torah reaccepted. And so maybe that's part of what we're doing on Shavuot. And if we're going to be accepting the Torah again on Shavuot, and there's also some beautiful like Sephardic customs of reenacting the marriage between the Jewish people and the Torah on Shavuot. But if we're like celebrating our anniversary with the Torah, then we should be thinking about what it means, what's our part in that relationship, and what does it mean to be a caretaker in that relationship to a certain degree, or maybe to a very great degree, as we'll explore together. And so that's one piece of Sphyra that I think in the positive way really makes this question important, because it's a question that cuts to our relationship with the Torah. And as we're counting up to Shavuos, that's really something we should be thinking about, is our relationship with the Torah. The second piece is the mourning aspect of Sphyra. And you can go back, last year we did a series, and Miriam Gedweiser taught about some of the great Talmudic stories that have to do with the mourning part of and the plague associated with Sphyra and the death of Rabbi Akiva's students. And what that's a story of is people who maybe didn't know how to take care of the Torah appropriately. And that may be part of what we're mourning during Sphyra, at least if we connect it to the death of Rabbi Akiva's students, and not just to the Crusades and the many other things that have happened to the Jewish people during this time, is a sense that there's definitely a way to get this wrong, and that we have to study it in order to make sure that we get it right. So those are kind of the two reasons why this is a great time to be asking this question, to be looking into the Talmud stories about Torah mataha aleha, the Torah, what is to become of her. But I think it's also just great. I think these stories are awesome. So we're going to be doing kind of two things in each class. One is straightforwardly just enjoying a phenomenal piece of Gemara together. And that means that sometimes we'll be talking about things that aren't directly related to this question of like the Torah, what is to become of her, because every time that phrase appears, it appears within a Talmudic story that is just a phenomenal story all in its own right. And I'd love for us to just like enjoy these stories together, think about some of the scholarship around them, all of those things. So that's part one. And then part two is that we'll be exploring this question of Torah mataha aleha. So we'll both kind of hopefully in each class have some insights into a great new piece of Gemara that we've learned together, but then also have some insights into the responsibility that we may or may not have vis-a-vis protecting the Torah and what that entails. Okay, so today we're going to look at a failed case, a time where this question was asked and the answer given is a wrong one. But in order to look at any story in the Gemara in general, what we like to do is to look at it in context, because in the Talmud Bavli, stories are usually not just kind of like plopped in randomly, but most scholars believe that stories are really brought in sort of purposefully into where they are in the discussion, and that the halachic discussion impacts the Agadata, the story part of the discussion, and vice versa, that the story comes along to complicate the halacha. And different scholars think those two pieces of the Talmud interact in all different ways. So, I mean, obviously, or not obviously, but classically, yeshivot kind of like skipped the Agadata, or said, okay, like it's Agadata story time, everyone. And, my high school teachers would just open up the Agadata in English, read it through, move right along. That's not really what we at Drusha like to do with the Gadata. But that the newer way of thinking about it is that they both influence each other. And then the next question is, does the Gemara internally recognize actually a distinction between halacha and agada? Meaning, when the Gemara brings a story into a halachic discussion, does the Gemara recognize itself as having this like shift in mode? Or is the Gemara saying, no, this is just part of the halachic discussion, and one of the ways in which we talk about halacha is through story. I love that idea because I think that's a very real way of talking and learning about law. The same way I was teaching a group of a friend who is a professor at a Catholic university in Texas invited me to just like Zoom into her class on Monday of this week, and all the students were asking me like, how do you know what to do if there's so many laws to follow? And it's a really phenomenal question. I said most of the way you know how to do it is by living it, and by living it around other people who are living it, and you learn how to live it by watching other people who are living it. And what that means is that story does play a big role, because then you'll say to yourself, next time something happens, you'll say, oh, I remember when my mom was cutting potatoes and she this, and then there was some cheese that fell into the potato, but it was made for a meat meal. So like, what am I supposed to do now? So then she called this great rabbi on the telephone, right? It becomes this whole story when really it could have just been cheese fell on potato, wanted to serve potato, fleishig meal, can I? But that's not how we engage with the law. We engage with the law as part of this like lived experience with all the details, and my mom and her rabbi and the phone call, and she couldn't reach him the first time, whatever. I'm just making something up. But right, like that's very true to kind of like how we live halacha. That halacha and story are very intertwined. So why could that not also be the case within halachic texts themselves, when they bring in story, that those stories are really like meant to be part of the halachic conversation? Okay, yes, it's organic. Thank you, Debbie. That's a very good comment. Okay. I have given so many words of introduction right now, and I often feel like Jewish educators could like give the full hour just of introductory material, because we love our material very much. We just want to tell you about it. But instead of doing that, we're going to actually jump in. So I'm going to share my screen. And also our source sheet has been put into the chat by Chaya. And that is also very good. Okay, so, oops, okay, it's open to the wrong place, but we will correct that forthwith. Okay, so our main text is the Gemara in Kiddushin 66a. And I brought we don't even get to the story part until the bottom of this first page. And I just want to show you a little bit about the source sheet before we fully dive into it. So this stuff that's in italics here, that's a Rashi. I did not translate the Rashi, in large part because this is the William Davidson Steinsaltz translation from Sphyra, and they often incorporate Rashi in, even though it's like not really exactly what the Gemara said. So first of all, I left you that. But second of all, I didn't have time to fully translate. So when we look at Rashi's, which again, here you're seeing, here's a Rashi, and then here's some source material that Rashi's quoting that I just brought in for you. And it kind of just like fit nicely because the English just takes up so much more space on my sheet. We aren't going to get to the question of Torah Matahel for a number of pages here. So we'll make sure we do that. And then we go back to the halachic conversation at the end. We're going to be talking about a Hasmonean king named Yanai. So Yanai is usually assumed to be this guy, Alexander Yanai. I don't know how we normally pronounce that. There is some question in the Talmud when it refers to Yanai as to whether the Talmud and the rabbis in general do not love the Hasmonean kings. And so some people think that when the Talmud talks about Yanai, they just use Yanai as this like catch-all for like all the Hasmonean kings at once. And they don't actually mean like the particular historical figure. And maybe it's just like, yeah, some Hasmonean king. Okay, they're all Yanai, it's me. So some people think that, and some people think, no, it's actually this guy, Alexander Yanai. And you can see that like so he's the son of John Hyrcanus, who is the son of like Shimon the Maccabee high priest, who's brother of Judah the Maccabee. Okay, so just to kind of put them all into context. So you have John Hyrcanus, Alexander Yanai, his brother Aristobulus ruled before him. And then like you have these two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, and there's the Gemara actually also tells stories about them fighting with each other about various things. So we have a little bit of like Hasmonean material and history within the Gemara, and So they also appear. Fine. The other thing I wanted to just point out is that a version of our story appears in Josephus and Antiquities of the Jews, and but in his story, it's not Yanai. It's Hyrcanus. It's John Hyrcanus. It's Yanai's father, who was king and high priest like 2 before, because Yanai takes over from his brother, who took over from their father. Okay, so that adds evidence to the folks who want to say, yeah, the Gemara just uses Yanai as this Hasmonean catch-all. But some scholars think, no, it actually is Yanai, and maybe Josephus is wrong, and Josephus has a like worse version or whatever. So anyways, we're going to look a little bit at this version of the story. Sometimes it kind of depends how our time goes. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this Josephus. So if we don't get a chance to look at it together, strong recommend. It's on here. Take it home with you. It's not originally in Hebrew. It's originally in Greek. So I didn't bring it for you in Greek. Sorry. But this is a hyperlink. So if you want to fully like read more extensively, you'll be able to do it. All of Josephus is available in English through the University of Chicago, which is just an amazing resource. Thank you, University of Chicago. So you can follow that there. And then the last thing is that there is this great article by Professor Vered Noam, who is just one of the like most incredible Talmud scholars of our day. She's the only woman who's ever won the Israel Prize in Talmud. She knows I'm a huge fangirl, so if you ever meet her, you can be like, Leah Sarna taught me some of your Torah. And I love teaching people her Torah. Anyway, so she has a whole article about this, and here's the citation for it. So it's in the, I can try and put a PDF of it into the chat at some point. You can find it on JSTOR. So this is also a great, but extremely highly technical, but really full of wonderful things. Article by her about this, and if we have time again, we'll look at kind of some of her arguments about this story. But in general, her argument is that this story is very early, and that the benefit of the Talmudic version of the story over the Josephus version of the story is that in Josephus, you're getting the whole thing clearly in translation, whereas the Talmud may well be preserving a quite early text. And she draws all these comparisons between our story, the like Agadata part of the Gemara that we're going to look at, and like language and motifs from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so she's arguing that this is just the way that the Dead Sea Scrolls is literature of the Essenes, which were a Second Temple sect. Her argument is that this story is like Pharisee literature, like as if it were to be found in a cave, except that cave were the Talmud. That's how she ends her article. You can read it. Like the cave is the Talmud. Imagine, right? Like the Talmud's version of Qumran is right in front of us, and this is like a Pharisee document that we could have like dug up wholesale. That's kind of, or maybe with some like minor tweaks. You'll see some of those tweaks are obvious as we read it. Okay, again with the introduction. So sorry. Cool. Okay. All right. So let's begin. So here we're in the Gemara in Kiddushin, and we have a very kind of classic Gemara Kiddushin style question. Ibailahu, a dilemma is raised. Ishto zinta be'ed echad v'shotik mahu. So a husband is told by one witness that his wife committed adultery, and the husband remains silent, meaning he doesn't like pursue a sota ritual. He doesn't do anything. What is the halacha? Like, do we believe that one witness? So Abaye says Naaman. Abaye says, yeah, the witness is deemed credible. Rava Amar Eino Naaman. Rava says, no, we don't believe the witness because Have Davar Shebe Erva, because we're talking about something that is about forbidden relations. It's actually this in America and outside of Israel. That's this week's parsha. On Achremot, we have the whole long list forbidden relations, and anything that and we see in the parsha that forbidden relations carry extremely high kinds of punishments, And also anyone who's like sitting in Yavama right now in Daf Yomi has spent a lot of time thinking about forbidden relations. Anyways, okay, so it's a davar sheba erva, ve'in davar sheba erva pachu mishnayim, and we don't accept testimony with fewer than 2 witnesses for something that's like that level of serious, that it's a davar sheba erva. It's about our rayot. It's about forbidden relations. So Abaye is gonna bring a claim first, and then he's going to bring a story, and then Rava's going to reject the story. Rava is Abaye's chavusa, interlocutor, childhood friend kind of figure, and then Rava's going to reject it, and then Abaye is going to bring a second story, which is just like a great, like for the argument of like stories are how we teach halacha. I think this is like a really phenomenal sugya in that respect. But interestingly, Vered Noam does not think that the second story, which is the story that we're interested in, is like a really natural part of this sugya. She's like, this story was just plopped in here, and that helps you realize how early this like section of the Gemara is, that it was just some other thing taken, put in here wholesale. So I'm sure if she were here, she would have so much to say, and she would 100% be right. I do have some ideas about why the second story makes a lot of sense, but this first story makes a ton of sense. So if you are in Team Vered Noam of like the second story makes no sense here, you could say, yeah, the first story is what's meant to be here. The first story makes a ton of sense. Second story makes like no sense at all. Okay, so here's Abaye saying, where do I know this from? Mina Amin Allah. Dahahu Samya, we have a certain blind man, Dahave Masader Matnita Kame de Marshmuel. So he would review Mishnayot in front of Marshmuel. Yoma Chada Nagalai. One day, the blind man was late for his reviewing of the Mishnayot in front of Marshmuel. Below Havakate, and he wasn't arriving. So Marshmuel, being a very sweet teacher, apparently, sent someone to go look for him. Shadar Shlicha Avatre. So Marshmuel sent someone to go look for this blind man who would learn with him. Ada Azil Shaliach Bechada Orcha Ata Ihu Bechada. But unfortunately, the shaliach was, I guess, the messenger was like not very good at his job. So he went down one way, and while he was going, the blind man was coming in the other way, and they crossed paths and missed each other. Ki ata shaliach. So when the shaliach finally came back, he said, Amar Ishto Zinta. He said, I've been news your wife committed adultery. Atalakame to Marshmuel. So they came before Marshmuel, Amarle, and what did Marshmuel? And Marshmuel said to the blind man, "I mehemen lach zia afka v'i lo tapik." So Marshmuel said, if you believe this shaliach, who like Marshmuel is the one who sent the shaliach, not the blind man. If you believe him, then you should divorce your wife, and if not, then you shouldn't divorce her. So Abaye says, based on this, my love, if is it not correct to say that if you trust him, then mehemen alach delav gazlana, then you believe him that he's not some kind of thief, which is all to say, right? If you trust him, which is what Marshmuel said to Abaye, said to the blind man, simply means you trust that he's a valid witness. You trust that he is not a gazlan, not a thief, which would make him a not viable, not good witness. The standard is just, is this guy capable of witnessing? If he's capable of witnessing, then you should divorce your wife. Then his testimony stands, and it's sufficient for this like davar sheba erva, which Rava says, no, davar sheba erva requires a higher level, requires like a standard, like kind of high level testimony. But Rava interprets Marshmuel's statement of imehamen lach differently. He says, imehamen lach Trey. If you believe this guy as if he were 2 witnesses, you believe this guy with the strength of like 2 witness testimony, then then go divorce her. If you don't believe him with the strength of 2 witnesses, then do not divorce her, right? So Abai says, all the standard is just, is this guy a gazlan or not? Like, is this guy a thief? Can he be like a reasonable witness? And Rava says, no, it's a very high standard. If it's one guy, according to Mar Shmuel, it needs to be one guy as if he's 2 guys. That's like an extremely high amount of faith to put in someone. Most people are only one person. So that's the story, and it seems like Rava doesn't buy Abaye's argument based on this. So now Abaye comes back and says, okay, mina minala, right? Which is exactly what Abaye said above, right? Abaye said mina minala there, and he said mina minala there. So now we have Abaye bringing this second story, and this is our story. Okay, here we go. Buckle up. It's a wild ride. Okay, so remember what we're arguing about. We're in the middle of a machloket, Abaye v'Rava, about whether in a case where you have testimony from one person about adultery, whether that testimony is sufficient. That's the argument we're in the middle of. And somehow this story is theoretically meant to provide proof for Abaye's case that one is sufficient. Okay, but now we're gonna I'll remind you of that when we try and figure out how this supports one way or another. Okay, but get into the story with me for now. Okay, so the Tanya, we have a Breita. So it's already, right? The Gemara is owning this is early material. Maaseh b'Yanai hamelech. An incident occurred with King Yannai. Shehalach lakuchalit b'midbar, that he went to a place called Kuchalit in the desert. Ve'kivei sham shishim krachim, and he conquered there 60 cities. V'chazarato haya sameach simcha gedola. And when he returned, he had this great, extraordinary joy. The karal kol chachmei Yisrael, and he called all the sages of the Jewish people. Amar lahem, and he said to them, Avotinu hayu ochlim meluchim bezman shayu sukim bebinyan Beit Hamikdash. Our forefathers only ate salted foods when they were building the second temple. Af anu nochal meluchim zicher la'avotinu. We too will eat salted food in commemoration of our forefathers. V'ha'alu meluchim al shulchanot shel zahav. But what did they eat their salted foods on? They ate them on these golden tables. And they ate them. So here's Rashi. I summarized it a second ago, but here's what he says, right? When they were building the temple, because when they came up from the exile, like with Ezra and Nehemiah, and the return to Zion, they were very poor. And they were doing this like very expensive building project. So we too will eat salty foods in memory of our forefathers. And so we'll eat salted foods in commemoration to what they ate back in the day when they were so poor, right? The same way that like wealthy Jews now still eat salted herring, even though salted herring is a poor person's food. But we now treat it as like a delicacy to be enjoyed on Shabbos at Kiddush with a really good cracker. So too, they were eating their herring in commemoration of the impoverished builders of the second temple, and at the same time we'll give gratitude to God that we've seen success and wealth. Okay. Hayasham achad ish latz lev ra lial, a person of an evil heart, a scoundrel. There's a lot of scholarship about whether many manuscripts have like a different configuration of these words. They maybe don't have the word lave, and there's some suggestion that like lave is just like a messed up version of lots. The language for that is a ditography for anyone who loves academic language, and maybe it's just lots ra lial. Anyways, it doesn't matter, but there's some like manuscript variants there. So there's a guy there who's just like a really bad guy, and his name is Elazar ben Poira. Elazar ben Poira Shmo. Okay. Vayomer Elazar ben Poira Yanai Hamelech. So Elazar says to Yanai the king, Yanai Hamelech, King Yanai, Libam shel Prushim Alecha. The hearts of the Pharisees are secretly against you, right? So he gathered, these people had previously been referred to as Chachmei Yisrael, the sages of Israel. Now this guy, Elazar ben Poira, is referring to them as Prushim, as the Pharisees. Yanai says to him, Ma asa, what should I do? So maybe what should I do to like clarify whether they're with me or against me, something like that. And the suggestion by Elazar is Hakim lahem betzitz shebein einach. Okay, so it's a little confusing what these words mean, right? Hakim normally means to stand. So that's how the Davidson Gemara translates it. Have them stand by wearing the front plate between your eyes. So the Yanai is, as a Hasmonean king, he's also the high priest. That's very important. I should have probably said that before, but it becomes extremely important now, right? So King Yannai, as with many of the Hasmonean kings, is also the high priest, and so he wants him to put the tzitz, which has the name of God written on his forehead. He wants him to put it on, and then the Elazar's suggestion, according to this reading of it, which is also Rashi's reading of it, is you'll put it on and they'll all stand. So here's Rashi. Hakim lahem betzitz shebeinacha tin tzitz hakodesh al metzcha. Put the holy tzitz on your forehead, and then yamdu al ragleihem, and then they'll stand up because the name of God is written on it. And when they stand up, somehow, suggests Rashi, hem yigalu et libam, they will reveal what's on their hearts, whether they're cranky about standing up for you or not. It'll become clear. Are they happy that you're here doing this, or are they angry about it? And by the way, and then Rashi goes out of his way to say, this is just like an interesting, fun side fact that I also was very interested in when I read it. So I just brought it for you as like, we're just a little bit going off on a little Torah tangent here, but we're going with Rashi on a Torah tangent, so it's allowed. Okay. So Rashi says, even though it's not a time when, right, we know what Yanai is doing. He's eating salty foods on gold tables, celebrating a military victory with all of the rabbis, right? It's not Shat Avodah. It's not a time when he's working in the temple. But it says in the second paragraph of Kiddushin, Bigdei Kahuna Nitnu Lehenot Bahem. That the priestly clothes, the priestly vestments were given for the priests to enjoy them, which means that the priests are allowed to wear their priestly clothing even when they're not working, which is maybe not intuitive, right? Like, because everything in the temple is so carefully controlled. If you think a wrong thought while you're bringing a korban, it becomes pigul. Like, there's just so much like intensity around every piece of it. And the Torah has all these strict commandments about what the clothing should look like, right? All of Parshat Tetzaveh is about that. So like, you might think, yeah, you have to wear these clothes with like exactly the right intention all the time, and everything about it has to be perfect. You shouldn't be allowed to, and you're not allowed to get, by the way, if you get benefit from a temple item in a way that's inappropriate, that's called me'ilah, and it's considered theft. Like, you're stealing from the temple. So maybe if you wear your priestly clothes at a time when you're not doing priestly job, that would be me'ilah, that would be theft, and that would be a really big deal. It's a big deal to steal from the temple. And it makes sense in a way, because you're like wearing out the temple's clothes, right? The temple has a certain amount of like property manifested in garments for its staffers, and like you're wearing them out by using them by wearing them to do whatever, and that's not okay. You might have thought, right? That's what you would have thought, because everything in the temple is so carefully controlled. But in fact, the Gemara says that that priestly clothing nitnu lehenot bahem. No, they were given for the priests to enjoy in them, because the Torah wasn't given to angels of the host, which is just really a really fabulous read of, like, at the end of the day, the Kohanim, the priests, are people, and to have them, like, the minute they're done doing their work, strip essentially is not a reasonable request on behalf of the Torah, and therefore priestly clothes can be worn while you're not doing priestly work. Because if you couldn't do that, then, like, it would be basically impossible to wear them, because the minute your mind would wander, or the minute you finished your job but you still have to like walk back down the altar or something like that, you would be doing me'ilah. So it just would create too high a standard, and the clothes were not, the Torah wasn't given to angels, it was given to humans. So we allow Kohanim to enjoy their priestly clothes. Okay, that was totally a side note. I just thought it was really interesting and cool. So that's where Rashi takes this, that actually it would be totally allowed for Yanai to follow the suggestion of Elazar ben Poira and to put on his tzitz at the meal that he is holding. So Elazar ben Poira's suggestion is have them put on your tzitz, have them stand up, and like see how they react to that. Like see what happens when you do that. So Vered Noam argues, and this I brought in a footnote here. It's very long, but she suggests, this is just footnote 11 in her article about this, that the verb hakem in this context has nothing to do with standings, as ancients and moderns erroneously understood, but rather it means to make someone swear. So she brings like a million different reasons for why she thinks that. You can read them in your own time. But here's how to read it. Elazar advised Yanai to make the Pharisees swear by the tzitz, the golden plate that the high priest used to wear on his forehead. And what is the swear? The swear is that they accepted his dual authority as king and high priest. Even though Shir Krochmal here is arguing that Yanai was not in fact wearing it at the feast outside of the temple, though it seems like Rashi thinks that he was in fact wearing it at the feast, which is also like this very interesting kind of divergence there. And Elazar believed that the rabbis would refuse to swear, and thus proving their disloyalty. And she argues that swearing by the temple worship, by the high priest's clothes, especially by the tetragrammaton, which was engraved on the tzitz, was a common Jewish practice. And then she brings some citations for that. So Hakeem Lahem, Vered Noam argues, is make them swear by your tzitz that they support you as both king and high priest. That's her read of it. Rashi's read is put your tzitz on and see what they do. I think both are kind of like interesting and fun suggestions for how this might have played out, but also quite kind of different. Okay, so what did he do after that suggestion? Hakim Bahem Betzit Shebenina. So he followed the suggestion. That was just in case you're following along here. Okay, but now we are introducing a new character. His name is Yehuda ben Gedida. So Hayashav Zakin Echad Yehuda ben Gedida. We have an elderly man, and his name is Yehuda ben Gedida. Vayomer Yehuda ben Gedida Yanai Hamelech. Yehuda ben Gedida says to Yanai Hamelech, quote, Yanai Hamelech, Ravlach Keter Malchut, Hanach Keter Kahuna Lezaro Shel Aharon. Ravlach Keter Malchut is the crown. Let the crown of the monarchy suffice for you. Leave the crown of the priesthood to the descendants of Aaron. Okay, we're gonna pause for a second on that line. What does Ravlach remind you of? Put on your like Torah hat for a second. Who says Ravlach or some variation thereof? Good. It's an echo of Korach. Ravlachem. Very good, Debbie. So, but what's interesting is that who then is, right? Korach is the one who says Ravlachem. And here we have Yehuda ben Gedida saying,
no, it's Moshe who says it.
Moshe who says it? I'm wrong. I believe you.
Rav lachem ki kulam kidoshim.
Right, but isn't that Korach?
That's Korach, right?
It's Korach who says it.
No, v'lama titnasu al am Hashem. I think that's Korach who says it, right? I'm sorry.
Okay. I always get very anxious because I like mostly know Tanakh very well, and sometimes I make big mistakes. But in this case, I was pretty sure I was right. I did prepare for this shiur, but everyone makes mistakes. Okay, here, we're just gonna pull it up because that's what we do when we have a question. It's right at the beginning of Parshat Korach, which is here. Okay, here we go. Yeah, right. So we have Korach, Ve'kalu lifnei Moshe v'anashim Yisrael chamishim atayim. Right, all these 250 people. Ve'kalu al Moshe v'Aaron. They gathered against Moses and Aaron, and they said to them, Rav lachem. So the people gathered, i.e., Korach and his community, said, Rav lachem. Right? Shouldn't it be enough for you? All the people together are holy, and amongst them is God. Why should you hold yourselves lofty over the community of God? Right? So it's Korach and his Eidah speaking there.
I apologize. Moshe says Hama'at mikem.
Exactly, the opposite. Okay. Good, but it's very interesting, right? I get why this would be confusing to the read there, because this is the opposite of what you would imagine, right? Seems like Yehuda ben Gedida should be the hero, and in fact, he's speaking Korach language, and that is very confusing. Okay, so we're just gonna hold that like, do the authors of this story actually think what he's doing is right? So that's very interesting, because he says, Yanai, what we always imagine to be like the classic rabbinic argument against the Hasmoneans, which is just be the kings. You guys are great kings. We're so proud of you. Leave the kahuna to the descendants of Aaron, meaning don't do both. But the question is, right, they are descendants of Aaron. They are Kohanim. Usually the argument is the opposite. Usually the argument is go be Kohanim, let someone who's a descendant of Judah be the king. And that's not what Yehuda ben Gedida says here. So there's a lot of opposite things happening. First of all, he says, you who are a descendant of Aaron, go be king. And second of all, we have this guy, Yehuda ben Gedida, who seems like he's going to be like the hero here because Elazar ben Poirah is like a bad guy. But all of a sudden he's speaking Korach language. And the other thing I want to note is that this language of Keter Malchut, so we know this language of like different Ketarim. It shows up in early Midrashim, and then also it's in Pirkei Avot. But the only place in Tanakh that we see Keter Malchut is Vayasim Keter Malchut Berosha V'Yavlicha Tachav Vashti. Right? It's a very Book of Esther phrase. This Keter Malchut phrase. Okay. So we have a little bit of like, is Yanai King Achashverosh, that he's like hosting on these golden tables and pulling out big day and pulling out like priestly clothes while he's doing it, right? Right? And at the same time, we also have like a Korach figure. So that's like a lot of really interesting stuff all happening, all of this Agadah is here. Okay. So why is it that they said, if you had to, why is it that Yehuda ben Gedida says to him, go be king, leave, and you're not a real descendant of Aaron? Shahayu Omrim, here's the Gemara explains, Shahayu Omrim Ino Nishbe b'Modi'in, that his mother was taken captive in Modi'in. Vivukash Hadavar, also, by the way, Megillat Esther language, but here it's the opposite. And then we have back to Korach language for a second. Okay, so then, right, so the thing was looked into, the matter was investigated. Unlike in the Book of Esther, it was not discovered. And then the sages of Israel were expelled, Vibadalu, Chachmei Yisrael Bizam, in the king's rage. So I've been spending a lot of time pointing out all these parallels. Let me just summarize the story that just happened. Right, so we have Elazar ben Poirah, he says, make them stand up for your head plate, make them swear by your head plate, one of those options. And you have an elder named Yehuda, and Yehuda says, just be the king. And then the Gemara says, why is he maybe disqualified from the high priesthood? They were, after all, priests. And the answer was if his mother was taken captive, that would have disqualified her if she was taken captive, and women who are taken captive are assumed to have been raped, and that then disqualifies them from marrying into the priesthood. I recognize that that's like extremely challenging what I just said. That is the halacha, but it's obviously quite uncomfortable. Right, so mother was taken captive in Modi'in. She couldn't then marry into the priesthood, which great, and the fact that she did meant that Yanai loses his like priestly status, so he becomes a halal. But the problem is that's just an accusation. That's a hayu omerim. But they looked into it and they didn't find any evidence for it. And yet the rumor made the king so angry, and the sieges, like giving the rumor enough credence, it seems like, at least this is what I'm reading into the story, but it seems like the sieges giving the rumor sufficient credence made the king so angry that he kicked them out in rage. Okay, so that's like just like a side note within the story. So now we're going back to the story itself. So Elazar ben Poirah says to Yanai, after, like, imagine that this line didn't exist, and we're just going straight from the statement of Yehuda ben Gedidei to Elazar ben Poirah. But the problem with what Yehuda ben Gedidei said, which is why we needed that line in the Gemara, is that it alluded to this idea that Yanai was not fit for priesthood. And that is like a very touchy subject, clearly. Okay. So Elazar ben Poirah says to Yanai Melech, Hedyot Shabisrael, Kachu Dino, Va'ata Melech v'Kohen Gadol, Kachu Dincha, which more or less means, right, King Yannai, such as the judgment of a common person in Israel, but you are a king and a high priest. Is this your judgment as well? Which is just a way of him saying, you're really going to let them talk to you like that? You're really going to let them take the slander against you seriously? Okay, so just pause here in the middle of that story for a second, because if you were wondering, how does this relate to the debate between Abaye and Rava? And if Abaye's argument is, right, which is about, you have one witness who testifies that a woman committed adultery, can you believe one witness? So this is the hook back to that, more or less. And they're going to explain it at the end, but just wanted to draw your attention. So now we have this woman and we have insufficient evidence that she was raped or that she was taken captive. And somehow that creates all of this, like, I mean, not somehow, clearly there's all this like slander and rumors, and it's very bad. And Elazar ben Poirah says, Yanai, you're really going to let them make reference to those rumors against you? This is a terrible thing. So Yanai says back to Elazar, Ma eseh, what should I do? And Elazar says to him, Ima tashomeh le'etzati rum sim. If you listen to my advice, crush them, says Elazar to Yanai. Yanai says back, but if I crush all the rabbis, here's our question. Torah matahel, what is going to happen to the Torah if I crush all the rabbis? Isn't that going to be really bad for the Torah, right? Like Yanai cares about the Torah. Very nice. And the answer given by Elazar ben Poirah is, Hare krucha umunacha bekaran zavi kol ha'ortel ilmod yavo v'ilmod. Behold, the Torah is wrapped up and placed in a corner. Anyone who wants to study her can come and study. Okay. Torah matahela. What's going to happen to the Torah, says Yanai? If I kill all the rabbis, what's going to happen to the Torah? Oh, it's fine. She'll be in the corner. It's perfect. Anyone who wants to read will just come along and read. Okay, so now we have like an Amora interjecting, or Nachman Bar Yitzchak, who, by the way, is a student of Rava. So maybe he's like, you can maybe imagine, when you know all the characters, like fun to imagine that Abaye is sitting there like retelling this story, and one of Rava's students is kind of there in the crowd, and he's like sitting there totally rapt, and then he's like, he can't control himself, has to interject into the story, and now it gets recorded in perpetuity and confusion. Okay, so here's his interjection into the story. Nachman says, Miyan means Rakabo Minut. This is immediately Yanai became a heretic. How do we know what's Yanai's heresy? The Havali Lememar, because Yanai should have said, Tinach Sefer Torah Shebichtav Shebal Peh Mai. Yanai says, okay, that works well for the written Torah, but what about the oral Torah? Right? You can leave the written Torah in a corner. Anyone who wants to read the Bible as literature can go pick it up out of the corner, but we have a whole oral Torah, and that's supposed to matter also, says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. And this is how you know that Yanai started out kind of good and then became a heretic and ended up bad. Says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. And here's just how the story ends. His interjection is over. Miad v'tutzatar al yedei Elazar ben Poira. The evil arose and caught fire through Elazar ben Poira. V'hargu kol chachmei Yisrael, and all of the sages of Israel were killed. V'haya ha'olam nishtomim. The world was desolate. Ad sheba Shimon ben Shatach v'hechazir haTorah liyushna, until Shimon ben Shatach came along and returned the Torah to its former glory. There's another great series to be given about Lachzira, some like Atarali Ushna. That's another great line that appears in a bunch of really awesome parts of the Gemara, but it's not our line for right now. But basically, right, you have this big gap, and it's true, really, it is kind of true that there is a big Torah gap. What happened before Shimon ben Shetach? There's a lot of mystery about where was the oral Torah, who preserved it during that time. And here's the Gemara's answer for what happened during that time. King Yannai killed off all the rabbis. Okay. I want to time is little. We're going to come back to Abaye is going to wrap up how this supports his case in 1 second. But before we do that, I want to skip down to Josephus for just 1 second, because Josephus is bringing this up in the context of these big arguments between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And so just to show kind of is this Amoraic interjection? What is that really about? So for Josephus, the big debates between the Sadducees and the Pharisees are exactly about, does Torah Sheba'al Peh exist? Is it important? And I've just underlined all of the relevant parts here. So, right, we've heard it from old men that your mother was a captive, and all of that stuff was all of that stuff appears in Josephus. Okay, but here's where he takes it, where Josephus takes it. The Pharisees had delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers. That's his description of the oral Torah, which are not written in the laws of Moses. And for that reason, it is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory, which are in the written word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers. And concerning these things, it is that the great disputes and differences have arisen amongst them. And they say the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich and have not the populace obsequious to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side, which is very Josephus way of speaking. But right, the point is that this interjection by Rava's student by Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is actually exactly where Josephus takes it also, which is that if you're gonna say, well, we'll just put the Torah in a corner, it'll be fine, that's a very Sadducee kind of argument. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak would say Nizraka bo minut, this is when he becomes a heretic, what is that heresy? That heresy is the denial of the oral Torah, which is exactly the heresy of the Sadducees. And so that's very much how Josephus reads the story as well. And just to kind of add some interest to it, right? If it were going to be this classic story of the Pharisees are awesome and the Sadducees are terrible, then why do we have the Pharisee voice here speaking in the voice of Korach? So that's the big mystery of this. And that's why we have, that's where Verinoam comes in to say, and a lot of these very careful literary readings are very much hers or inspired by her here. That's where Vera Noam comes in to say, this is a much more interesting Pharisaic text than you would imagine, because here are the Pharisees saying, this guy is bad. We wish Yehuda ben Gedideh hadn't done that. He's a Korach. He doesn't represent us. We wish that he had made peace maybe with the kings, and maybe and really like we are distancing ourselves from him. And at the same time, like, yes, there is this level of like polemic and debate that's important. And at the same time, we sort of wish we could have been like more politically savvy in this moment. And there's actually something like quite complex going on here, which I think is a very interesting and beautiful read of this Agadah. And that's part of why she says it's like clearly very old, because some of its complexity is not how other parts of the Talmud like to think about the Hasmoneans. So all fine and good. I just wanted to like point that out since we had started talking about her, and that's one of her like really beautiful points that she makes about this. And the last thing I just want to say while we're still kind of in the story is Torah mataheh aleha, this beautiful question that King Yannai asks, and yet he comes up with the wrong answer to the question. Torah mataheh asks King Yannai, but he gets bad advice. He takes the answer of Elazar ben Poirah, who's clearly right, Ish Rab Lial, all these like terrible terms. And the answer is this like heresy answer that results in killing off your own intelligentsia and the preservers of your tradition, and a misunderstanding of what the Torah is. And so this is a case I want to argue where you have a great question, an important question, a beautiful question, but if you answer that question wrong, then the greatness of the question isn't all that matters. And I know we like to say as educators, oh, just like ask a good question. The questions are the most important thing. When I was in high school, I had a teacher who gave out dollar bills for good questions, and it was like a really big deal whenever someone got a dollar bill. But I think here we really have an example where you have a really great question and then a really wrong, bad answer to a great question. That's a really powerful, influential answer to a great question. And it ends up in the world being mishtomim, right? The haya ha'olam mishtomim. That's really bad. The world was desolate because of the wrong answer to that question. Now, did it have everlasting repercussions? Maybe not, right? Like it seems like the world was desolate until Shimon ben Shattach came along and restored the Torah to its former glory. So maybe it was fully restored to its former glory, but you always have to wonder, right? With all those people who were killed off, like how much Torah was inside of those people that we don't even know what that Torah was or what it might have taught us or where it could have taken the Jewish people and their leadership. And we'll never know the answer to that. So on the one hand, the Talmud says it was returned to its former glory. And on the other hand, you kind of have to wonder whether that's even possible when people have been killed. Maybe that's our Yom HaShoah tie in there. Okay, so just to round this out by going back to the halachic discussion in the Gemara here a little bit. So Heichidami Abaye, who's the one who brought this Agadah, says, what are the circumstances of the case? Ilema, if you'll say debetre amre, if you'll say that we have amre d'ishtabai, so if you'll say that we have betre, we have two witnesses who say that she was taken captive, uvetre amre lo ishtabai, and two witnesses who say that she was not taken captive, my chazi de samach ahani samach ahani. Why would you rely on these two and not on those two? Meaning, like, Abai is trying to figure out, we seem to not know what the story was with the mother of Yanai. How is it possible we don't know? So he's saying, oh, maybe you had two witnesses who say it went one way, two witnesses who say she was taken captive, two witnesses who say she wasn't taken captive. Ella, he says that, but like, why? But then why would you like believe anything? So what could be the source of such tremendous like doubt? Be'ed echad. It must be the case that there's one witness that she was taken captive. The Talmud, the Kamachashele, Beitre, and the reason that the lone witness ends up, right? They vivukash hadavar velo matzah, right? They look into it and then they didn't find an accordance. The reason why they didn't find an accordance with it is because you then had two witnesses. is because you then had two witnesses who contradicted. And if Abai says, if you didn't have those two witnesses, halavachi, then Mehemen, you would have believed the one. So Abai says, what's the story? One witness that says she was taken captive. That witness was contradicted by two other witnesses. But if that contradiction hadn't happened, you would have believed the one that she was taken captive. And that is the source of all the rumors. Like if we never ever believed one witness, then great. Why would there even have been rumors? It wouldn't have been strong enough for there to be rumors. No, sometimes we do believe one witness, but there happen to be contradicting witnesses here, says Abai. So that's why Abai brought in this story, theoretically at least. But I think what this story does is it teaches us the weight also of this whole conversation, that there's not just one woman who we have now all of these questions about her status, but what happens when we have questionable witnessing and we're not sure about the state, and we have debates about what appropriate standards for witnessing, evidentiary standards, like what could happen, says this story brought in by Abaye. All the rabbis could be killed and the world would be mishtomim, like the world would be left desolate. Like, what are the stakes of this conversation about evidentiary standards for women who commit adultery or women who were raped or davar shebe'erva, whatever it is, right? Things that have to do with these like basic kind of household relationships. The whole world could be destroyed by us not getting our act together about these evidentiary standards. I think that is the crux of like why this story is brought in here. So Professor Noam thinks the story is brought in here randomly, but I think this is the like main thing that this story is supposed to bring out. Is like, what are the repercussions of us not figuring out this halachic conversation? If we leave it vague, if we leave it open, then not only are families going to be destroyed, not only is King Yannai going to be maybe or maybe not eligible to be the high priest, maybe or maybe not a halal, but actually like the whole world could be destroyed by like ambiguities in this halakha, and therefore it's extremely important to have clarity. And that maybe Abai would argue, Abai is on team one witness is sufficient. Abai would say, if that clarity can be achieved with one witness, then one witness is good enough. And Rava is then going to push back. We're at time, so we're going to stop, and I can stick around for a minute or two if people want to ask any questions. I've just talked for an hour straight, but Rava is going to push back and bring some other possibilities of things that happened, and you can keep reading the Gemara here if you want. But I want to finish by just going back to our question of Torah Matah Aleha, and because that's what we'll be following in the future weeks, is the Torah Matah Aleha stream. So in this case, this is an unusual case where we have this beautiful question, and it's the right question, and the stakes of the question are actually even higher than the Torah, right? The whole world was desolate because of the wrong answer to that question. So it's an important question, it's a high stakes question, and it's a question for which you can get the answer wrong with massive repercussions. So that's where we're ending for now, but we'll be back again in 1 week with a new story and a new set of makarot and a new vantage point and perspective on this question. And I look forward to continue exploring it with you. Thank you for joining. And we can definitely take any questions if people have. I know, Adira, you just showed your face, so I don't know if you just want to say hi or whether you have a question.
I do have a question, and hello.
Amazing. Hello, great to see you.
I was wondering if Yanai's mother, if she would have said whether she was captive or not, if her evidence would have been considered anything.
Doesn't seem like it in this case.
Because like just because of like amigo, like if, let's say she said she was captured, like would that like have helped her or hurt her case, or with the one witness, like combined with her testimony and the one witness? I don't know. That would make a difference.
That's interesting. I don't know the answer necessarily, but usually like you're not really believed if you testify about yourself, especially something that would then be disqualifying for you, right? Like if you testified about yourself that you did something that would disqualify you from being married to your husband, like we typically don't believe you. So
You need outside witnesses.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom. Fascinating.
Shalom. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks for joining.
I'm
All right,
sorry. I apologize again. It was rude of me. I'm sorry.
It was not rude of you at all. If I got something wrong, I would be really delighted for you to tell me. And listen, you got me to open up my Tanakh. It's good. We should always open up our Tanakh when we're talking about it. It's Torah Shebechtav for a reason. We shouldn't be saying it by heart, you know? It's a good lesson. So thank you. And don't worry about it. Please don't lose any sleep.
I have another like question about like what he was saying about how the Torah is in the corner. Anybody can take it. Like the rabbis don't seem to have a problem with that. Like leaving the Torah, like the Torah Shabbat in the corner, that's okay.
I
Or
mean,
anybody
it's
that comes
rolled,
read it?
it's wrapped up nicely. You know, we all do that all the time, I guess, right? Krucha v'karen zavid, it's wrapped up in the corner. Yeah, right. You're right that the objection is about the oral Torah, not about the written Torah. But I do love also, right? Anyone who wants it. Who is anyone, right? Are we anyone? There's something that's like very intriguing there as well. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming.
That's all the questions. I want to thank Rabbanit Leah Sarna for a great class. And thank you to everyone who joined on Zoom, on Rishu Live, and on Facebook. We're going to continue with Rabbi David Silber's regular Journey Through Genesis series on Sunday at 10 a.m. And we're continuing our Sphyra programming on Sunday at 8 p.m. with a session from Rabbi Shlomo Zakir called The Scope of Torah. You can find more information on this class as well as all of our spring programming on our website at drisha.org/classes. Thank you again to Rabbanit Sarna for this opportunity to learn with you and to everyone who attended. And we hope to see you again soon.